afternoon po everyone and welcome to the third International Conference on Cordillera Studies held virtually over Zoom this month of July. This is panel 4, the assessment of programs and policies in indigenous communities. My name is Karin Kojase Bangsoy. I teach political science here at the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and I will be your moderator for this panel. With me as assistant moderator is Sir Jeffrey Javier of the Cordillera Studies Center, UP Baguio. We have two presenters for this panel who will lead us in our discussion on the intersection of indigenous peoples, policy, and law, particularly in the Philippine setting. Our panel this afternoon will proceed as follows. We will have the presentations of both panelists, followed by the time allotted to the audience for questions and open discussion. May we remind the participants to send their questions through the chat feature and to include their name and affiliation when posing their questions. Questions may be sent at any time during the presentations, but they will only be discussed during the open forum. So with these reminders, let us begin our panel presentations on the assessment of programs and policies in indigenous communities. Our first speaker is Prof. Marvin Soriano. He is a faculty member at the Department of Social Sciences in Central Luzon State University, Science City of Muñoz, Nueva Ecija. Researching on Philippine religions, politics, and cultures, he obtained a master's degree in Philippine Studies from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His presentation is entitled State Interventions and Identity Formation in Indigenous Communities, the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program or 4Ps, and the Sama Badjao of San Andres, Manila. So without further ado, may we share the presentation of Prof. Marvin Soriano.
Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. The title of my presentation is State Interventions and Identity Formation in Indigenous Communities, Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program, and the Sama Badjao of San Andres, Manila. Here is the outline of my presentation. I will briefly discuss the introduction, research objectives, conceptual framework, concepts and theories used, methods, initial findings and discussion, and finally, conclusions. Many ethnographies romantically describe the Sama Badjao, also known as Sama Dilao, to be peace-loving, boat-dwelling nomads whose relationship to sea is integral to their history, economy, and culture. The Sama Badjao are merely part of the larger ethno-linguistic group called the Sama, originally based in Zamboanga and the Sulu archipelago. Recent decades of social unrest in southern Mindanao have pushed many Sama to seek refuge elsewhere, mostly in urban centers. In areas like Metro Manila, the Sama have taken on another identity. A good number of them have relocated to Muslim enclaves, which are typically poor and discriminated against in the majority Christian Manila. Most internally displaced and discriminated against, however, are the Sama Badjao. Many become mendicants, part of the informal settlements, and have yet to be mainstreamed. Many Sama Badjao are neither registered at birth, enrolled in schools, nor have records in healthcare system. Thus, the term Badjao has become a label to connote poor, indigent, and marginalized. The Sama are recipient of many government programs on poverty alleviation and social development. Notably, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, or the DSWD, have Sama Badjao clients among their programs such as Conditional Cash Transfer, Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino Program, or what we now know as the 4Ps, Kapit Bisig Laban sa Kahirapan, Comprehensive and Integrated Delivery of Social Services, Kapangyarihan at Kaunlaran sa Barangay, Kalahi, CIDSS, and the Salinlahi Program. The agency has also convened several conferences dedicated to Badjao affairs. What must be kept in mind, however, is that the Sama are not a homogeneous group. Among the Sama communities of the Metro Manila, there are generational, religious, and class differences. Several Sama in Metro Manila are fully integrated into their communities, have successful livelihood and enterprises, and are very much socially mobile. Nevertheless, many state intervention categorize Sama migrants as indigent status and overlook the many cultural differences between the different Sama groups. The Sama's varied reception of state intervention programs are hinged on these cultural differences. State interventions aim to enhance the development of their clients, For the Sama, they act as a means of acculturation as well. The Sama are not only given inputs on how to merely survive in an urban center, but how to become part of the dominant culture too. This study is interested in how the state interventions with their intent to acculturate the Sama in Metro Manila cultures and structures affect the identity formation of the Sama in San Andres, Manila. Here are the research objectives of this study: to provide an ethnographic description of the Sama Bajau and their cultural and historical location, to understand how state interventions succeed or fail in integrating the Sama Bajau into the mainstream culture. Second, identify the actors and in various state intervention programs in which the Sama become clients or recipients, and determine the Sama's degree of involvement and participation in the said programs. Third, survey how the Sama recipients rate how much they think state intervention programs have affected the different aspects of their development, whether economic status, social status, and self-esteem, as well as their participation in their indigenous culture and the dominant culture of San Andres, Manila. Fourth, find out what are the parameters, tools, and discourses invoked for state interventions to identify who are deserving recipients of its social development programs and how the Sama are justified as recipients. Here is the conceptual framework of the study. State interventions are targeted towards the development of their clients. Development is felt in terms of material gains, which is economic, sense of inclusion in the community, which is social status, and self-esteem, which is personal status. In the case of the Sama Bajau, state interventions are also means to acculturate them into Metro Manila culture. Acculturation is measured by the extent that the Sama participate in the dominant culture and the extent that they can participate and express their own indigenous culture in Manila setting. The degree of involvement that the Sama Bajau have with state interventions affects their development and determines their responses in dealing with acculturation. The convergence of development and acculturation thus forms the identity of the Sama Bajau in San Andres, Manila. The following are the concepts and theories used in this paper. Development. Governments are tasked to protect and provide for the interests of their citizens and those who are in their territories. It is not enough to comply with the bare minimum so that citizens are safe and nourished. Government are expected to ensure development or the upward ascending movement featuring greater levels of energy, efficiency, quality, productivity, complexity, comprehension, creativity, mastery, enjoyment, and accomplishment. A Marchescen's capability approach focuses on what people are able to do and be, as opposed to what they have or how they feel. This paradigm proposes that the government development initiatives should be evaluated based on the freedom and opportunities they grant for people to do or be what they value most. Just as it had adopted the UN Millennium Development Goals in 2000, Philippine Development Agenda aligned with the UN Sustainable Goals in 2015. The SDGs have special emphasis on urgent action to combat climate change, as well as securing opportunities for vulnerable sectors, migrants, refugees, and stateless persons included. Acculturation, as used in sociology and anthropology, commonly refers to cultural assimilation or cultural integration. Psychologists tend to see acculturation in terms of changes in personal values, behavior, and beliefs. In this study, we see the acculturation as affecting the Sama Bajau on all these levels simultaneously, the societal and the personal. J.W. Barrie's model of acculturation categorizes the different responses to acculturation based on two things. First, the degree with which the respondent participant engages with her indigenous culture, and the degree which she engages with the dominant culture of her society. Assimilation happens when the individual wishes to strengthen the relationship to the other culture while discarding one's own. Separation happens when an individual wishes to maintain the heritage of one's culture and avoids or curbs the influence of the other culture. Marginalization happens when the individual is not willing to be part of the other culture, but show little to no involvement in one's culture of origin. And integration happens when an individual wishes to maintain one's culture of origin while at the same time participating in the other's culture. Marginalization. Outside of J.W. Barrie's definition of marginalization as a response to acculturation, the term marginalized is also used to describe people who have been denied development. Many news articles, policy papers, and studies have used the word marginalized to describe the Sama Bajau. What it means to be marginalized or how marginalization is defined leads, however, to different approaches in terms of policy and state intervention programs. Identity. Though there are many studies on the culture of the Sama Bajau, not many have emphasized their sense of identity. In this study, identity deals with the individual's sense of belonging, claimed affiliation, and personal conviction. The identity of Sama Bajau, for example, are not the qualities attributed to her by others, but rather self-determined construct of who she is. A review of several theories on identity may help clarify this nuancing. Identity has a social and personal dimensions. Identity can refer to how a person belongs to a group, social dimension, and can also refer to the dignity, pride, and honor attributed to that mode of belonging, personal dimension. However, James Fearon reveals that the recent trend among many studies nowadays is to use the word identity to socially distinguishing features that a person takes a special pride in or view as unchangeable but socially consequential, social and personal all at once. A human being may have many identities. This is to say that her simultaneous relationship with other human beings, with the environment, with the social structures, and the supernatural give her different ways to understand herself, where she belongs, and where her loyalties lies. A Sama Bajau of San Andres can be a Muslim, a Manileño, a Mindanaoan, a daughter, a sister, and a leader all at the same time. Now for the method. Initial data gathering was conducted in San Andres, Manila in January 2020. Further fieldwork and data gathering were halted due to the lockdown imposed by the government in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The researcher employed a participant observation method and made appointments with key informants. There was a tour around Barangay 704 in San Andres, Manila to gather ethnographic description of the area. 30 respondents for informal interviews were selected in a snowball method. The researcher had opportunities to engage in informal and semi-structured interviews with the informant's neighbors. Here are the initial findings and discussion. The Sama Bajau and all Sama in general have been discussed at length to students of Philippine culture as an indigenous group whose relationship with nature is filled with romance, mystery, and the supernatural. The Sama are among the largest and most diverse ethno-linguistic groups of insular Southeast Asia. There are significant populations of Sama in Indonesia, particularly in Sulawesi, and in Malaysia, particularly in Sabah. However, studies show that majority of Sama originate mainly from the Philippines, in southern Mindanao. The Sama have a shared Austronesian language, which is Sinama. They are also commonly known to be expert shipbuilders, live in stilt houses along coastal areas, and have a very maritime-oriented culture. Sama Bajau speakers comprise one of the most widely dispersed ethno-linguistic groups indigenous to Southeast Asia. Though there are land-based and shore-based groups, the Sama Bajau most known to urban centers are the sea-based groups. All respondents in this study come from Zamboanga. All of them cite two main reasons for moving to Manila: conflict and hunger. It can be argued that historically, the Sama Bajau are no strangers to being marginalized. Those studies can prove how they predate the dominant Tausug in the Sulu archipelago. They traditionally occupy the lowest rank of hierarchy in ethnicities. The Sama Bajau have long been embedded with patron-client relationships with the dominant land-based groups. Their inferior position is mostly attributed to their nomadic lifestyle and non-assimilation of mainstream religions such as Islam or Christianity. Their movement across seas is influenced by climate change, seasonality of fish, and most recently by social unrest. While the Philippines has its fair share of challenges in dealing with the Sama Bajau, its government also provides many opportunities for integration. In the Philippines, the Sama Bajau are considered indigenous people and thus covered by the Republic Act number 8371, known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. The National Commission in Indigenous Peoples is the agency assigned to hold their rights towards ancestral domain, self-government, and cultural integrity. Most popularly associated with the plight of the Bajau in urban areas are the Department of Social Welfare and Development. Many Sama Bajau are clients of poverty alleviation programs such as the 4Ps, the Kalahi CIDSS. The Sama Bajau are the specific clientele of the Salin Lahi program, which integrates cultural heritage and expression as part of social development. What links the researcher to the Sama community of San Andres, ironically, isn't the mutual knowledge of supposed Sama culture, but the talk of state intervention of government programs was the easiest way for the researcher to establish rapport with the Sama community. Through initial fieldwork, the researchers' initial assumptions about the Sama were constantly challenged. The primacy of state intervention as a means for the Sama and the non-Sama, those in their community and the researchers included, to connect and relate to each other stood out more and more. To narrow the study, the researcher decided to focus on the state interventions that occur within Barangay 704 and to what extent these interventions affect the Sama Bajau of San Andres, Manila. Whereas most indigenous peoples in the Philippines strongly identify with a specific ancestral domain, the Sama seem to care more about who they are with rather than where they are. Though they have been technically driven out of their hometown as refugees, many Sama don't seem to see themselves as displaced or deprived since they are surrounded by family in Manila. When asked if she felt any fear of moving to Manila as a young woman, one respondent said, "Basta may kamag-anak, hindi kami natatakot." Many other respondents feel the same. To them, what matters is where the family is. The only reason to go to a place is to visit family, and little by little earn money to transfer them to one place where most of the family is. No matter how they try to make San Andres their home, the Sama still experience discrimination on many levels. Most obvious is the differentiation of religions. On one hand, the Muslim Sama are not as free to express their religion as Christians are. On the other hand, there are also various strains of Islam that discriminates against the Muslim Sama for their culture. For example, the traditional dance called Igal being practiced by the Bajau is haram, says Khalid, the administrator of the local masjid. Haram means forbidden in Arabic. To Khalid, encouraging the Sama to continue Igal, Pansak, and other folk traditions make them stray away from the true Islam. Di pwedeng i-preserve ang kultura ng mga Bajau, he says. Khalid is a Yakan, and though he is Muslim, he sees himself differently from the Sama. Khalid is particularly disappointed with NGO and the DSWD and their seemingly preferential treatment of the Sama, especially the Sama Bajau. He says he sees the 4Ps program as spoon feeding. The researcher quietly notes this dissonance. Khalid says that the government wants Bajau to be integrated to the community. They should be given education. The researcher notes yet another dissonance. The 4Ps gives beneficiaries cash transfers for as long as their children are enrolled in school. If there's one thing that Khalid doesn't like about NGOs and government programs, it is that they try to commodify the cultures of the people in the community, especially the Bajaus. He said that while government have the intention to help a certain group, they do that with hidden agenda of preserving, quote unquote, a culture, even if it is against Islam. Khalid seems to interpret the promotion of Sama cultural heritage as state-sanctioned discrimination against Muslim. State interventions in the Sama of San Andres seem to have a paradoxical relationship. The further the program is to them culturally and in terms of proximity, the more sympathetic it is to their differences. What do we mean by that? Government interventions from the level of the barangay and the city are more oppressive to the Sama than interventions from the national level. Many Sama are part of the DSWD's 4Ps program. The 4Ps offers cash transfers to the poorest of the poor. For as long as the heads of the family, mostly mothers, take part of learning seminars and in meetings and make sure that their children are checked up on local health centers and attend public schools. As a follow-up to 4Ps, many barangays have adopted DSWD's Kalahi CIDDS, wherein barangays are encouraged to make site-specific livelihood programs for their constituents. Salin Lahi is also another DSWD program wherein the Sama Bajau, classified as one of the 4Ps indigenous peoples, are given incentives to teach their traditions to younger generations. The Sama of San Andres, Manila, the Sama of San Andres are migrants to Manila. They have left Zamboanga because of poverty and conflicts, but continue to connect with it through through their enterprises and mobility, have integrated aspects of Zamboanga in San Andres. They can easily survive and thrive in the culture of Manila, but choose not to assimilate. They proudly express their indigenous culture through their language, dance, music, and religion. However, these expressions of culture also bring with them culturally embedded othering. The Sama among themselves experience multi-leveled and finely nuanced differentiations in terms of religion and ethnicity. On top divisions among themselves, they constantly deal with the struggle of being a minority in Manila. They are more empowered socially by a national program such as 4Ps and the DSWD. They are more oppressed by the rescue missions of the barangay and city-level government interventions. This is alarming considering that they are made most unwelcome by those who are nearest to them. If the DSWD wants to sustain its initiatives in developing the lives of the poorest of the poor, they must target not just to uh, uh, the cooperation of beneficiaries, but of surrounding institutions as well. Apparently, the city, the barangay, and the local masjid have very little sympathy for their clients. A positive note, however, is that 4Ps beneficiaries seems to have more positive self-esteem and more socially integrated than non-4Ps beneficiaries. This makes them less prone to separation and more likely to cooperate with state interventions. The DSWD and other similarly oriented organizations can tap into the ability of integrated Sama to communicate with the separatist and marginalized Sama to bridge these gaps. The main contention will be to address culturally embedded othering, a reflex inherent in all the Sama and non-Sama inhabitants of San Andres. For the overall description of respondents, all 30 respondents to this survey are female, married, and with children. They are all 4Ps beneficiaries. All respondents claim to be Sama, but differ in whether they claim to be Bajau or not. Majority of the respondents indicated that they were Muslim, while the rest did not specify their religion. Majority of the respondents also had lived in San Andres, while the remaining 7 respondents had lived for 9 years, 5 years, and 3 years, respectively. All respondents had at least 3 children. Majority had 3 to 5 children, while 7 had 6 to 10 children, or rather 8 had 6 to 10 children, and 1 was pregnant. 7 had 6 to 10 children, and 1 was pregnant, anticipating her first child. With regards to perception of social economic security, more respondents, or 36%, agreed that benefits derived from 4Ps are sufficient to meet their basic needs than those who disagreed strongly and disagreed at 27% each, and 10% strongly agree. Majority of the respondents agreed that their families' lives are improved through the program, with 2% noting strongly agree. The remaining 43% disagreed, and 1% strongly disagreeing that the program has improved their family's condition. Majority of the respondents said they were unable to save and invest, while 37% feel they have the purchasing power to buy what they want for their families and save a little. In terms of their perception of social inclusion, when asked if the program was instrumental in their social relations, 64% of the respondents affirmed that they are able to get along more with other 4Ps beneficiaries in San Andres. 73% also confirmed that the program has strengthened the relationship with fellow Sama. 52% of respondents responded negatively when they were asked if the program strengthened the relationship between Sama and non-Sama. With regards to self-esteem, 85% of the respondents responded in the affirmative when asked if they feel contented with who they are, with 9 of these responding strongly agree. Of those who feel contented, 52% still see themselves negatively occasionally. When asked if 4Ps help in improving their self-esteem, 17 out of 30 respondents, or 57%, responded negatively. 14 out of 30 respondents also agreed that they don't have much to be proud of. In terms of their participation in indigenous and dominant culture, majority of the respondents find it easy to understand Tagalog, although only 11 respondents are fluent in using Tagalog. All respondents disagreed when asked if they can speak English, and only 2 of them can easily understand English. 73% of the respondents affirmed that they still continue to practice their indigenous traditions in Manila. The same 73% of the respondents also affirmed that it is easy for them to participate in the dominant culture in Manila. All the respondents identify themselves as Sama, and all except one affirmed that they identify themselves as Sama Bajau rather than a Tagalog from Manila. In terms of claimed identity, 25 of 30 respondents, or 83%, identify themselves as Filipinos. 5 of them agreed that the Filipino-ness of the Sama and the Tagalogs in Manila are the same, but the same number also agreed that their group, the Sama, is different from other Filipinos. This same set of respondents, 5 out of 30, also agreed and strongly agreed that their being Sama is separate from them being a Filipino, and that their being Sama is way above or more apparent to them, or mas nangingibabaw than their being Filipino. In terms of acculturation and identity, being part of the 4-piece program seems to have little to no effect in the Sama respondents' language preferences. Almost all beneficiaries have little to no proficiency in English but understand conversational Tagalog. They all refer to speak in Sinama or Sama Bajau, which some of them call Muslim. Neither does being 4-piece seem to affect their participation in indigenous culture. Majority say that they are Sama, and majority are willing to be labeled Manileño. Majority of the beneficiaries insist that their ethno-linguistic groupings makes them distinct from other Filipinos, and feel that their ethnicity is more important to them than being a Filipino is. Conclusion: though the DSWD's 4-piece is driven by a development framework that aims to enable minorities, engagement in the program does not necessarily affect the Sama's sense of being integrated into the dominant culture, and neither does it foster a sense of being able to transcend ethnicity as a claim identity. In terms of differentiation within the Sama, the respondents insist on the specificity of their being Sama or Sama Bajau or Sama Dilaot. More Sama tend to be beneficiaries. The Sama Bajau are distributed among the beneficiaries and the non-beneficiaries. Those that the Sama and the Sama Bajau identify as Sama Dilaot are mostly non-beneficiaries. It also seems that the 4-piece has little to do with the Sama's sense of belonging in the community. All respondents agree that the 4-piece might make the Sama and non-Sama get along better, but they don't agree that the 4-piece can change the dynamics of the community better. In terms of acculturation, beneficiaries all seem to be integrated. Most express that they feel they can do their traditional indigenous practices in Manila as they have in Zamboanga, their hometown. There are those who mention that they are not able to practice fishing traditions in Manila. However, other things such as Zamboanga fashion, food, celebrations, and ceremonies were practiced in San Andres as in Zamboanga. As is expected, the older respondents are less fluent in Tagalog than the younger ones. Both young and old, though, prefer to use Sinama more than Tagalog. The result of this initial study showed that inclusion in 4-piece as a state intervention has little to do with the respondents' sense of belonging to the community and their self-esteem. The respondents desire to be part of the 4-piece for the economic benefits, but they don't think it does much to bring them out of poverty. All of them recognize that they are poor and are in need, but none associate their poverty with being Sama. In fact, all agree that poverty is much worse in their hometown. Some even feel they are fortunate in Manila because, unlike in Zamboanga where you would have to fish all day to get a little food, dito sa Manila, uupo-upo ka lang, may pagkain ka na. Neither does this affect how much of their indigenous culture they get to express in Manila. What seems is that the Sama come to Manila proud of their Sama identity, regardless of if they feel discriminated against initially. What matters to them is that they are with their kind. Inclusion in 4-piece also does not affect their claimed identities. Most of the respondents see themselves as Filipinos, but at the same time think that their being Sama or being Bajau is more important to them than their being a Filipino. This might be due to their assumption that to be Filipino is to be Tagalog, whereas most of them have already expressed a preference for their own language. Lastly, this initial survey shows that the 4Ps as a state intervention have very little effect on the identity formation of the Sama in San Andres. The researcher recognized that result might differ if there were a larger sample size. What seems more interesting to investigate, though, is how a different state intervention, those conducted by the local government as opposed to the national scale, of 4Ps, affect the Sama's development and acculturation. Magsukol. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Prof. Soriano, for that interesting presentation on the impact of the 4Ps on the identity formation of the Sama Bajau in San Andres, Manila. Unfortunately, it seems that Prof. Soriano has not yet entered the meeting, and while we hope that he will be able to make it later for the question and answer forum, if the speaker is not present during the time that we have for the open forum, we will not be able to take questions for this presentation. So for those who have entered a bit late during the meeting, you may actually check the presentation on the YouTube Live, which will be also uploaded, I believe, after this session. So to line up our next presentation, it is entitled, In Retrospect, the Supreme Court Decisions Involving the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, to be presented by Attorney Hendrix Bongalon, Attorney Clifford Chan, and Attorney Carlo Benedict Nagpala. So we will be sharing their video presentation, and afterward, we will be opening the floor for questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. Our topic for this presentation is, In Retrospect, Supreme Court Decisions Involving the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. The presenters for this topic are Attorney Hendrix C. Bongalon, Attorney Clifford C. Chan, and Attorney Carlo Benedict L. Nagpala. Republic Act number 8371, otherwise known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, was passed and provided for the recognition of rights of indigenous peoples or indigenous cultural communities as follows: the recognition of their right to ancestral lands, the recognition of their right to self-governance and empowerment, the recognition of their human rights and promotion of social justice, the recognition of their right to cultural integrity, the recognition of their right to free, prior, and informed consent, and finally, the creation of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. Following the passage of this law, its constitutionality was challenged in the case of Cruz versus Secretary of the DENR, or the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. In this case, however, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the IPRA law. Now, for our study, what we did was that we pored over the different jurisprudence involving Republic Act number 8371. However, through the years, there is a lot of jurisprudence and too much to discuss everything in this paper. So what we have done is that we have actually categorized the discussions or issues in these jurisprudence and simply identified major issues, which are free, prior, and informed consent, jurisdiction over disputes and claims, the special case of Baguio City, the characterization of NCIP as a government body, and the rights of a CALC holder, or a Certificate of Ancestral Land Claims holder. From this, we proceed with our observations and finally our recommendations. So we begin with the issue of free, prior, informed consent. The case of Madela versus Oceana, Philippines Incorporated discussed the application of FPIC to migrant IPs or ICCs. So, the scope of indigenous cultural communities or indigenous peoples who are required to give their free and prior informed consent does not include migrant IPs or ICCs. Mere residency does not give rise to the right. We have subsequently the case of Alvarez versus Picop Resources Incorporated. Here, the topic is of the issuance of a certificate or precondition assuring compliance with the requirement of free, prior, and informed consent. Section 59 of Republic Act 8371 is clear and unambiguous, which provides that the certification from the NCIP that the area affected does not overlap with any ancestral domain is needed, and all government agencies are enjoined from renewing or granting any concession, license, or lease without the said certification. Further, Section 3 of the same law provides that ancestral domains remain as such, even when possession or occupation of the area has been interrupted by causes provided under the law, such as voluntary dealings entered into by the government and private individuals or corporations. With respect to jurisdictional issues, we discuss the claims and disputes involving rights of ICCs or IPs. Here we talk about cases such as Unduran versus Aberasturi, Galang versus Wallis, Republic versus Paus. So if the parties belong to the same ICC or IP, jurisdiction, or rather the authority to hear and decide cases, would belong to the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, or the NCIP. If the parties belong to different ICCs or IPs, jurisdiction would belong to the regional trial court. The exceptions would be: first, if adverse claims and border disputes arising from the delineation of ancestral domains or lands are involved, and two, cancellation of fraudulently issued CADTs. And for our last column, if one of the parties is a member of an ICC or IP, while the other party is a non-ICC or IP, jurisdiction would belong to the regional trial court. Exceptions would be similar as the previous column discussed. What is the rationale or the reasoning of the court in this regard? First is that there would be a violation of due process if non-ICCs or IPs would be bound by the customary laws of ICCs or IPs. Second, non-ICCs or IPs are not bound by the customary laws of ICCs or IPs. And third, customary norms are varied. Therefore, customary norms may vary from one ICC to another ICC, so there may be difficulty in interpreting and applying these norms to different parties. With respect to criminal cases, we refer to Ha Datu Tawahig versus Cebu City Prosecutor et al. In the first column, if the parties belong to the same ICC or IP, the resolution of the criminal offense through the application of customary laws will not divest the court of its jurisdiction over the case. In the second column, if the parties belong to different ICCs or IPs, the resolution of the criminal offense through the application of customary laws will not divest the court of its jurisdiction over the case. In the last column, if one of the parties is a member of an ICC or IP, while the other party is a non-ICC or IP, the court shall take cognizance of the criminal offense. What is the rationale with respect to this? Because a crime is an offense against the society. It is a breach of the security and peace of the people at large. Then we have the issue on the special case of the city of Baguio. So the IPRA expressly excludes the city of Baguio from the application of the general provisions of IPRA. Section 78 of the IPRA law provides that the city of Baguio shall remain to be governed by its charter, and all lands proclaimed as part of its town site reservation shall remain as such until otherwise reclassified by appropriate legislation. Section 78 is a special provision in the IPRA law, which clearly mandates the city of Baguio shall not be subject to provisions of the IPRA, but shall still be governed by its own charter. Second, all lands previously proclaimed as part of the City of Baguio's townsite reservation shall remain as such. Third, the reclassification of properties within the townsite reservation of the City of Baguio can only be made through a law passed by Congress. Fourth, prior land rights and titles recognized and acquired through any judicial, administrative, or other process before the effectivity of the IPRA shall remain valid. And fifth, territories which became part of the City Baguio after effectivity of the IPRA are exempted. So this is in accordance with the case of Republic versus NCIP. Of course, NCIP, with respect to its characterization, is under the executive branch of the government. NCIP is an agency under the executive branch, rather than the judicial branch of the government. Its orders are not judicial orders, which are within the authority of sheriffs as judicial officers to execute. So this is in accordance with the case of Letters of COC Marian Gaisi Mirabueno versus RTC OCC, General Santos City. Furthermore, in accordance with Anak Mindanao Party List Group versus the Executive Secretary, the NCIP is an independent body under the Office of the President. The characterization of the NCIP as an independent agency under the Office of the President does not remove the body from the President's control and supervision with respect to its performance of administrative functions granted under Section 17, Article 7 of the Constitution. However, the Congress also did not intend to place the NCIP under the control of the President in all instances, as evidenced by the IPRA, which provides that the decisions of the NCIP in the exercise of its quasi-judicial functions shall be appealable to the Court of Appeals. With respect to rights of a CalC holder, the rights of a CalC holder is limited to the occupation and cultivation of the ancestral land. As holders of a CalC, respondents possess no greater rights than those enumerated in paragraph 1, section 2, article 7 of DENR Department Administrative Order number 2, series of 1993, which provides that the rights and responsibilities of ancestral land claimants is limited to occupation in relation to cultivation. In comparison to number 1, paragraph 1, section 1, article 7 of the same DNR DAO, which expressly allows ancestral domain claimants to reside peacefully within the domain, nothing in section 2 grants ancestral land claimants a similar right, much less the right to build permanent structures on ancestral lands. An act of ownership that pertains to one who has by a recognized right by virtue of a certificate of ancestral land title. This is in the case of Feza versus Garantes. So what would be our relevant observations from these cases? Notably, jurisprudence focuses on the following issues: jurisdiction over disputes and claims involving indigenous cultural communities or indigenous peoples. Second, the characterization of the NCIP as a government agency. And third, the persons, both judicial and natural, covered by the IPRA law. So the issue of jurisdiction has been repeatedly discussed by the Supreme Court because of the tendency of trial courts to dismiss cases involving the ICCs or IPs. Thirdly, since the Supreme Court always resolves the issue of jurisdiction, there is a delay in the resolution of the substantive issues raised by ICCs or IPs in cases that they instituted. So this may actually result in a delay in the administration of justice, contrary to what is desired, right? Fourth, there are no jurisprudence that expounded on or interpreted the scope of substantive rights granted to the ICCs or IPs by IPRA law. And fifth, there are very limited discussions about the coverage of ancestral lands and domains. Generally, the Supreme Court has opted to stick to the guidelines passed by the NCIP and stuck to what has been provided in the IPRA law itself. But of course, we note that there are evolving discussions, such as in the case of People versus Sana. In this case, there was reasonable doubt as to whether a Mangyan who cuts down timber within their ancestral domain can be convicted for illegal logging under Section 77 of the Forestry Code. So what would be our recommendations for the study? So considering first and foremost that jurisdiction is the highlight of majority of jurisprudence, and that, again, jurisdiction would fall regularly to our regional trial courts. Why? Because most of our cases would involve non-IPs or ICCs. We feel that there's a need for specialized training for judges involving IPs or ICC cases, or the creation of specialized courts handling IPs or ICCs. This may be warranted for cases involving IPs or ICCs and non-IPs or ICCs. Notably, these are the exact cases which involve a large ICC community, such as large-scale exploitation activities, mining, etc. Okay. Second, we believe that the incorporation of international customs, practices, and doctrines involving IPs or ICCs may be considered by the Supreme Court in future cases that it will resolve. Notably, we observed throughout the jurisprudence that there was barely any mention of international customs, practices, and doctrines involving IPs or ICCs. So, for example, in terms of international practices, the government may consider engaging IPs or ICCs as caretakers of ancestral lands under paid stewardship arrangements similar to foreign states such as Australia or New Zealand. And of course, there are case citations and jurisprudence in America, New Zealand, or Australia, which may warrant examination by our local courts as well. Third, further amendments to the FPIC process may be warranted in light of the rulings of the Supreme Court. Noticeably, there are difficulties in terms of appreciation of the administrative powers of the NCIP, and these are intrinsically tied to jurisdiction. So there may be a need for clarification with respect to these matters. However, these will require amendments in the administrative issuances issued by the NCIP itself or the IPRA law in itself, by itself. So that is our discussion. I hope that we have contributed significantly, or we have brought some room for discussion through this topic presentation. Thank you.
Thank you to our presenters for the second presentation. I believe that they are present here in the meeting, so we can accept questions regarding the second presentation on Supreme Court decisions involving the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. So with that, as we have ended our presentations, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience here in the Zoom room, and likewise for those who are watching on YouTube Live. Again, a reminder to use the chat box for your questions and to put your name and affiliation when posing your question so that we may address it promptly. So again, this is open for both our attendees in the Zoom room and for those on YouTube Live. So perhaps we can have 5 to 10 seconds for our audience to send in questions while our speakers for the second presentation, attorneys, kindly be ready. You may turn on your video and your audio once we pose the question. So we are now open for questions from the audience. Kindly send it in the chat box. All right, to start off the discussion, we have one question here. To the attorneys, so this is for your presentation. What is the importance of this legal jurisprudence in policymaking on the executive side of government regarding the indigenous people's issues here in the Philippines? So anyone can answer from the presenters?
Yeah, actually jurisprudence, jurisprudence is something that is valuable also in policymaking. Though it is mainly for the enlightenment of the bar and the bench on how subsequent decisions will be made but it could also help our executive branch in their policy making. Because first, once the Supreme Court would interpret an administrative order or the law, then the legislation or the administrative branch can actually see into it that their vision of the law or the administrative issuances is really understood well or interpreted well. Because and if they'll see that there is lapses on how the issuances and on how the law were enacted in such a manner that even the Supreme Court was not able to really capture the vision of the law, then they can make or they can enact subsequent legislation or subsequent issuances to fill in those gaps as manifested in the decisions of the Supreme Court. Kuya Clifford and Attorney Clifford and Attorney Carlo may also answer. Attorney Carlo, nakamute po kayo.
On mute, I think.
To add to that, well, basically Supreme Court decisions bind the entire Philippines, even the executive branch of the government. Actually, in one of the cases that we have digested, particularly the case of Unduran, we have seen the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court insofar as the policy of NCIP is concerned. In the administrative order issued by NCIP, initially, it was indicated that every dispute involving indigenous peoples is cognizable by the National Commission on Indigenous People. However, this was interpreted by the Supreme Court, and as per the Supreme Court, there is no provision that exists in the IPRA law stating that NCIP has jurisdiction over all cases involving indigenous peoples. So the provision in the administrative order issued by NCIP was actually struck down as unconstitutional. Since it's unconstitutional, it is incumbent upon the NCIP to draft or issue subsequent administrative orders which would conform to the ruling of the Supreme Court. So that is how the Supreme Court affects the policy making of the executive branch of the government.
Thank you very much, attorneys. Yes. Baka may i-add si sir.
Wala naman po. I agree with what both of my co-presenters have mentioned, that generally it sets boundaries. It reminds executive offices to enact interpretive policies in the spirit of the law. Yun lang po.
All right, thank you very much. And we would like to acknowledge the presence of Prof. Marvin Soriano here in the Zoom room. So to our attendees and to those on YouTube Live, we can now accept questions as well for the first presentation on the 4Ps and the Sama Bajau. So if you have any questions on both or either of these presentations, you may raise them in the chat box. So we have the questions. They are now coming in from Prof. Annalyn Salvador, VP Baguio. Thank you for your presentation, attorneys. I wonder how the IPRA benefits IP's intangible cultural heritage. So any of the presenters?
As to the intangible cultural heritage, we actually have provisions in IPRA, but unfortunately, we still don't have a jurisprudence on this. But there is a provision in IPRA about indigenous intellectual properties. And so even intellectual properties which are intangible assets or cultural heritage are protected under the law. And we have DAO Joint Circular, Department Circular between NCIP and the Intellectual Property of the Philippines, covering the reportorial requirement in cases where indigenous elements are incorporated in certain products. And I think that is the main protection of the law with regards to cultural heritage of indigenous communities. Though personally, I don't know and I don't think it's sufficient, but it is something that we can actually maximize and utilize.
To add to that, it's sort of laying the groundwork for future policies that we could adopt in relation to the recognition of community intellectual property rights. If we look at foreign states or other states such as New Zealand or Australia, they actually reward utilization of based utilization of corporations or persons or by the state for the use of community intellectual property, stewardship, handbags, etc. So there is actually an extent of recognition, valuation. They establish means or they make studies on how to value community intellectual property. So they try to attempt how to value the contribution, the training, or the practices of indigenous knowledge utilized by the state in preserving the land, in indigenous practices utilized by the government, and they try to actually compensate indigenous communities for the utilization of such knowledge and practice. So what is actually enriching in foreign practices that could be reflective in our own laws through the IPRA is that it could actually allow for a richer reward, of greater recognition of the rights of both IPs or ICCs and the state. So it allows for a balancing act to take place in this scenario.
Okay, thank you very much, attorneys, for that very comprehensive answer. The next question in the chat is from Nedakar, Marlo Luguban. How would the specialized training of judges or specialized courts happen? Which policies would these courts refer to? Do we even have enough documentation, or do we need documentation of these customary laws, Council of Elder Customs, etc., for such a specific training?
I think the training would be provided by the Philippine Judicial Academy or PhilJA. So this is the body under the Supreme Court that provides special trainings for judges, particularly lower court judges. Now, insofar as the sources of the trainings are concerned, they will only focus on IPRA law and the Supreme Court decisions, particularly on the issue of jurisdiction. Now, with regard to the documentation of customary laws, I personally believe that there's no need for the trial judges to be informed with regard to the different customary laws involving indigenous peoples, because if we would look at the table based on the presentation a while ago, they will only handle cases involving indigenous peoples if the conflict involves them and non-IPs, and in which case they would apply not the IPRA law or the customary laws, but actually the national laws. So that's the problem that we have actually recognized in our study. Whenever the case involves an IP element, there's a tendency for the trial courts to dismiss the case because they feel that it will involve the application of customary laws or it will involve the interpretation or application of IPRA law. However, it's very clear on the decisions rendered by the Supreme Court that their jurisdiction is limited to disputes between IPs and non-IPs, which will not require the application actually of customary laws, but by national laws like the Civil Code of the Philippines, the Revised Penal Code of the Philippines, and so on and so forth.
In addition to that, as mentioned by Attorney Bongalon earlier, we noticed that there are new issuances passed relating to joint circulars issued by the IPOPHIL on intellectual property or for relating to traditional knowledge. So I think it's important to arm our courts with respect to this because these are the courts, the same courts that actually handle intellectual property cases, so that they will have specific knowledge relating to intellectual property and indigenous knowledge and how to reconcile that those policies. So we actually have new policies every day, every year. So it's important to have our judges keep abreast of these policies.
Okay, thank you for that. We have one last question. We have another question in the chat. Is there any feasible legal and structural reconciliation between indigenous customs versus national customs? Or is it the law that legalizes the praxis of hegemony between the metropolitan contra the subaltern? Therefore, is deconstructing the present structure the only last resort? More theoretical take on the topic. Anyone from the presenters may answer.
Actually, that is one of the main issues raised in Cruz versus the Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources, right? That and many people think that our national law are actually homogenizing practices and somehow even indigenous peoples communities are by nature, 'di ba? Ano yan eh. It's not really homogeneous. It's heterogeneous. But I think there's really at this point, because of the heterogeneity of our society, and of course our national law really would cover everyone, as and it will apply to anyone. But the IPRA law, I think the IPRA law is a good and something that we can start off that will recognize the heterogeneity of our society. That's why even in jurisdictions, as discussed earlier, the NCIP should not take cognizance between, as a matter of general rule, conflicts between indigenous peoples from different ethnic communities, because their traditions, their practices are are different, no? And yeah, it's homogeneous, not homogeneous. Okay. So and I think also yung law, the law being used to hegemonize. And I think that still the IPRA is one or is a product of this one. And if we are to look at it at this point, yes, still our national laws, no, are using being used as a tool to perpetrate hegemony. But I think the Philippines with these laws, with different issuances, and with this jurisprudence, no, kasi nag-ano naman tayo eh, nagiging dynamic naman yung discussion on this, are trying at least to reconcile that. And there are some points where our national laws and customs nare-reconcile, but but admittedly, may mga parts pa rin talaga tayo na mahirap talaga i-reconcile. That's just my take on the matter.
For me, I don't think there's that the law. I agree that there will be some points and issues that certainly we will find conflict, but I don't believe that the law actually perpetuates this culture of hegemony. If we look at the intents of the law, it is intended to protect your communities in this instance. And actually, analyzing the situation, we are still proceeding from the foundations, right? But we are trying to progress from that by having more conversations with communities and the state. And despite what may be perceived to be slow progress, what we have here is a harmonization of both the national law and of course our customs. So I don't believe that there is hegemony in this instance. But if you also look at what was mentioned earlier with respect to evolving discussions, the Supreme Court itself recognized that in the case of People versus Sana, that Yormangyan, there was reasonable doubt in that case because they do recognize the concept of ancestral lands, domains, and of course indigenous rights in this instance. So we have an evolving discussion spurred by the Supreme Court itself, and it's something that your courts may interpret for future cases as well. So I believe that there is no hegemony in this instance, but there is only room for evolution of discussion in this instance and harmonization of both issues.
Yes, also, and I may add yung the discussion in Secretary, again, yung sa Cruz versus Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources. Actually, di ba, may take na mukhang baliktad that we're putting the indigenous peoples on a better position daw under the IPRA than the rest of the nationals. Di ba? Parang reverse yung iniisip nilang hegemony. But then again, the Supreme Court upheld na no, actually, because this is a response to the special and the historical injustices and historical oppression that experienced by the indigenous peoples. So yun yung inaano talaga nila na yes, by nature, diba, sa society natin, there is this chunk between the majority of the population versus the indigenous peoples, and these law are actually meant to or an attempt to at least approximate yung distance or yung domination ng majority of the population as opposed to the indigenous peoples.
Okay, thank you for that. And actually related to this question and this discussion, of national versus the indigenous peoples. Now, we'd like to call on Prof. Marvin Soriano to answer this because this is related to the first presentation. No? So given that, and given also that legal context, no, and given the data that Prof. Soriano presented in his earlier presentation on the Sama Bajau in the 4Ps, how then can we reflect or take into account the multiplicity of identities, especially indigenous identities, in policy making, especially in social welfare policies and public service provision, such as the 4Ps? So, Prof. Marvin?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon po. Sorry I wasn't able to join much earlier kasi nag-switch ako ng device. Hindi ko ma-access kanina yung aking link. Regarding sa question, maybe I would like to relate that question po sa idea ng cultural commodification, kung saan yung mga state interventions such as the 4Ps, kung merong possibility na ma-commodify yung culture ng isang indigenous people, kasi isa din yun sa mga na-raise na issue while I was writing this paper, no, yung issue na our state interventions, no, tries to commodify the culture of indigenous people. Based sa observation ko sa culture ng Sama Bajau and based sa mga several field works ko sa community while I was conducting this paper, the idea of cultural commodification is not really the issue, kasi indigenous peoples such as the Sama Bajau were actually given opportunity by the government or state intervention such as the 4Ps, no, for them to showcase their culture. Say for example, their traditional dance such as igal, pansak, and so on. Kasi merong mga nagre-raise na mga cultural groups that yung ganitong klase ng mga policies, state interventions, try to endanger or commodify the cultural integrity of such people, no, katulad ng mga Sama Bajau. Pero in a sense, as gathered by the data sa paper na to, they were actually, katulad ng nabanggit ko, they were actually being given the opportunity on the part of the Sama Bajau. They were given opportunity to showcase their culture, and that state interventions do not necessarily commodify or threaten or endanger or misrepresent the culture of a particular group. No, kumbaga parang mas nabibigyan pa nga ng opportunity itong mga indigenous peoples na to really practice yung kanilang culture, yung kanilang traditions in ways na hindi nila magagawa in other means, for example. So hindi ko lang kung nasagot yung question, pero doon ko siya i-relate sa idea ng cultural commodification.
Okay, thank you, sir. My follow-up question po to that. So, is acculturation a specific objective, or is this necessary when providing public social welfare services, especially to groups such as the IPs? Can we not just provide social welfare without the acculturation aspect? So how should we design policy then?
On part of the government, in trying to absorb or in trying to adopt the Sama Bajau, for example, nandun yung parang yung idea that they also need to fulfill. Ganun kasi parang naka-design yung 4Ps sa mga indigenous communities. They are required to, say for example, send their children to schools. Mothers are required to attend seminars on, say for example, katulad ng mga nabanggit ng mga respondents ko, seminars about homemaking, for example, mga livelihood. So I guess ganito yung setup ng policy ng mga state interventions, no. It's possible siguro na gumawa ng ganitong policy without requiring them to fulfill such requirements. Pero ang kung yung point ng question is that possible ba na magbigay na lang without adopting or itong mga indigenous people na to sa mainstream culture, possible naman siguro doon. Pero kung tatanungin natin yung mga indigenous people na to who are very willing, no, to submit themselves sa ganitong process, para lang magkaroon siya, for example, ng allowance. I guess they will be willing no, na mag-undergo ng process of acculturation no, ng mga ganitong klaseng state interventions. But again, yung ganitong klaseng state interventions does not necessarily naman kumbaga threaten the cultural integrity of the Sama Bajau. Specifically, sila ay mga nomadic communities, no? And yung idea ng ancestral domain, for example, is absent sa mga Sama Bajau because katulad ng data na nag-gather for this study is that kung nasan yung kanilang family, nandun yung kanilang community, for example. And mabigyan lang sila ng opportunity to practice no their traditions, no they are willing to showcase no what these communities have, no not really thinking of acculturation or ganitong klaseng or indoctrination siguro ng government sa mga indigenous peoples. So, hindi na nila concern yan kumbaga.
Okay, thank you, sir. Very interesting. And we have a comment in the chat. Another example of a social welfare program, the DSWD has an unconditional cash transfer program where money is given to certain indigent groups, and IP groups may also be included. So another question along that vein of designing policies and related to that, changing laws, a question for the attorneys who presented on the IPRA. So do you think there is already a need to amend the IPRA law based on your findings? And if so, what particular provisions need significant amendments? Anyone from the presenters of the second paper?
Yeah, sige, ako muna. I personally feel that IPRA was enacted in 1997, but there are some few jurisprudence already on the matter. But compared to our other laws, hindi pa ganon talaga ka-rich yung jurisprudence no on IPRA. I'd rather siguro let's wait for decisions when it comes to the more pressing ones, like more decisions on ancestral lands, more decisions on because there are no decisions talaga that has reached the Supreme Court na ang main tackle is yung right to self-determination, yung ancestral lands. And to me, I'd rather wait on that and see from there if there are gaps in the law with regards to those main issues. But as regards to yung mga nakita namin no na lapses or possible improvement on policies, to me it can be addressed by administrative issuances, and that can be addressed by IPRA. But if we are to amend the law now, siguro yung special case ng Baguio, it has to be we have to look back on that, on the application of IPRA in Baguio City. Siguro yun lang siguro ang as of now personally ang nakikita ko, but others I think can be addressed with administrative issuances but by the NCIP and with other agencies. And I'd rather wait for decisions on more issues like yun nga, ancestral domains and self-determination. That's just my take.
Okay, thank you po. Si Attorney Nagpala.
Okay, probably just a specific provision in IPRA with regard to the right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent. The right of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent has been mentioned in IPRA, but in relation to other rights. There's no exact provision discussing the concept of free, prior, and informed consent under the IPRA law. So the concept of free, prior, informed consent was just elaborated through the issuance of an administrative order by the NCIP. Now, this is okay, but again, as I mentioned a while ago, there was already an instance wherein an administrative order issued by the NCIP with regard to their jurisdiction was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So we do not know if there would be an instance later on if the issue of FPIC would be involved and the other party or the developer might question the validity of the contents or the provisions of the FPIC administrative order issued by the NCIP. So to remove any cloud of doubt with regard to the process involving FPIC, it would be better if it would be incorporated in the law itself. After all, most of the projects that would enter ancestral lands and ancestral domains would start with the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people. So I believe there should be a highlight with regard to this right in the IPRA law.
If I may also
And
add,
in
I
addition,
agree. Sorry.
probably also a categorical provision with regard to intellectual properties created by indigenous peoples in the advent of information technology. As indigenous peoples, they are also capable of creating or inventing new objects and new materials. We are not necessarily sure if these are covered by the IPRA law, although there are already administrative orders again issued by the NCIP. Okay.
As I would like to agree with what my co-presenters have mentioned. In addition, I believe that there is a great degree of flexibility in the law in its current state, which allows for some issuances. However, the degree of flexibility may also pose some problems if there are particular issuances which may be interpreted as over-expanding beyond what was intended to be provided by the law. So in terms of actually ensuring that, for example, proper valuation mechanisms, proper compensation, or just compensation will take place if ever there is the utilization of community intellectual property. Or for example, there is the utilization of land, ancestral lands, or there is the engagement of projects by corporations or the state. How do you ensure that there is proper valuation, proper compensation? I believe that there may be better protection if these were expressly articulated in the law itself. So if that is the intention of our lawmakers. So because as it is, any expressions of compensation or valuation would not be expressly found in the law or even possibly in your administrative issuances as they currently in their current state. So perhaps recognition expressly in your law may be warranted to give better protection or at least compensation should there be exploitation or the utilization or commodification as you may interpret in this instance. So in relation to that, we wish to also recognize that the idea of free, prior, informed consent is actually to recognize the right of self-determination in this instance. So I think that is something that we always have to recognize, that it's actually the state, as was mentioned by Attorney Bongalon earlier, giving back the right of self-determination to affected IPs or ICCs. That is all.
Okay, thank you, attorneys, for your input. And thank you, Attorney Chan, for touching on the last two questions in the chat box. I think we have time to just discuss these two. No? So addressing the issue on IP's right to self-determination, given the fact that the ruling state was created by colonial-headed parties and groups, such as the pensionados or the political capitulators. And follow-up question from Prof. Annalyn Salvatore. Does this mean that there is a permissive commodification with state intervention? So perhaps we can also ask for the input from Prof. Marvin Soriano on the side of policy and social welfare policies for indigenous peoples. What are your thoughts po on the right of the IP right to self-determination in these policies? And the question of Prof. Salvador on permissive commodification with this state intervention. So Prof. Marvin, are you there po and to answer these last two questions?
Yes po, I would like to comment po siguro sa last question. Again, yung issue ng cultural commodification. I guess I would not call that permissive commodification on the part of the Sama Bajau, for example. Kasi if we are going to ask those indigenous people in San Andres, Manila, if that is a kind of commodification na ginagawa sa kanila ng state interventions, they would reply that it's actually an opportunity for them na i-showcase yung kanilang traditions, traditional dances, for example. Siguro commodification happens on the part of the government when it misrepresents kumbaga yung kultura ng isang community. No, it happens when the state, for example, treats, say for example, the dance of or the eagle dance of the Samabajao as a kind of commodity na yun na yung sinasabi ng administrator ng isang masjid na nakausap ko sa ano na to na merong hidden agenda yung state in trying to require these people in order for them to have yung cash or allowance, kailangan muna nilang mag-perform and so on. Pero again, siguro pwedeng sabihin na permissive, but these Sama Bajau people are willing to grab this opportunity na ma-showcase nila yung kanilang mga traditions na nabanggit ko nga kanina na hindi naman nila makukuha in other instances if not because of the state trying to ask or request yung mga Sama Bajau to perform in fiestas or in barangay events, for example, or even performances in universities where this Sama Bajau get to be invited. So yun po yung take ko po doon. Siguro commodification does not happen when a particular group of people willingly offer what they have, showcasing what they have as a people and as a community. And if the government does not misrepresent or threaten yung particular na culture, particular people. So, yun po yung sa akin.
Thank you to our presenters. We've really had a very interesting discussion this afternoon, and there are no more questions in the chat box. So in our discussion we have raised, the finer points of Indigenous people's culture, identity, perhaps most importantly, power and agency. In these policies and these laws. And the jurisprudence that has come out of it. So it's clear that there is much that has to be done, but also we've also come some way, in terms of Indigenous peoples in policy and in law. So perhaps instead of asking any more questions, I would like the presenters to give any last words for this panel on the assessment of programs and policies in Indigenous peoples communities. So any last words po to close off our discussion this afternoon?
Siguro I'll start before my kuyas, no? And to Kap, no, I'd like what our moderator said. We've come a long way, but there's still so much to be done, and that's the realization that hopefully we've all made after this afternoon's presentation. Now, with regards to policies or laws or jurisprudence, I hope that as Indigenous peoples and as advocates, we should maximize what's in there, in the policies, in our laws. Then let's maximize this in our advocacies, in our battle, in our struggles. But then again, we should not stop just because there's already IPRA. We should not stop just because there are already this department orders. Because again, as what our moderator said, there's still so much to be done, and we still have a long battle ahead of us.
To add, yes, thank you, of course, to the University of Baguio for giving us this opportunity to give our presentation, and thank you for all of our audience for actually asking us very stimulating questions. And I think these are the types of discussions that we would like to have moving forward. Recognizing the fact that, as was mentioned by Attorney Bongalan, there is much more to work with. We have to move forward in terms of a lot more ways. We have to emphasize the fact that in terms of the status quo, there has been disenfranchisement, there has been discrimination, and there has been disempowerment. That is true. That is why what we should desire moving forward is to utilize the law to empower people, to make them more able to combat the effects of disenfranchisement, to give them back power, and to give them a more level playing field when it comes to the power to demand what is just, what is right. And that can only come with knowing what is the right. what is proper valuation, and when to say no if you do not wish to be objectified, or if you wish to not to be commodified in that sense. These are actual some of in terms of some of our counterparts. For example, in Australia, New Zealand, you have some certain indigenous rights and practices which cannot be registered in the as intellectual property because it is actually inherent to their right. So these are policies that we can further benchmark with from our foreign counterparts and create more policies in terms of how to reconcile people's right to their own intellectual property. And if they do not want to share this, or if they only want to keep it as a tradition for the community only and not for commodification purposes. So these are things that we can truly strike a balance with in terms of policies moving forward. I will now yield the floor to my other presenters.
So, Attorney Nagpala, perhaps you'd like to end off pa yung colleagues' last words niya for this panel.
Okay, thank you very much for giving us the chance to present our paper this. So thank you for giving. Thank you for giving us the chance to present our paper this afternoon. I'm sorry I'm having technical difficulties with the charger of my cell phone. So based on our study, it's very obvious that IPRA law has a lot of provisions that are still unexplored, still that needs elaboration on the part of the Supreme Court. So I hope in the future there would be.
Hello, mukhang nakat po yung audio ni Attorney Nagpala. But we thank the presenters, the attorneys for their presentation. Prof. Marvin Soriano, your last words po, parting words for this panel. Prof. Marvin, if nandito pa po sa meeting, mukhang wala na rin. All right, so but we are very thankful to all the presenters for their input and for their interesting insights in this discussion today. So thank you as well to our participants here in the Zoom room and those watching on YouTube Live for contributing to this discussion and pushing it further with your questions. Again, you may review this session on YouTube once it is uploaded after this streaming. We'd like to remind everyone that the next set of parallel sessions is starting in a bit, actually at 2:30, so I will let everybody go. Please check the links emailed to you in your conference kit, and we will continue to stream each session live on YouTube. The links are posted on our Facebook page, Cordillera Studies Center public page. So thank you very much for joining us in this panel and in this virtual conference. We hope that you will continue to enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the conference for all Mondays of this month of July. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much. You may now move to the next session of this afternoon's conference. Maraming salamat po.